Poilievre was in Europe, actually in the UK, to give a speech. And then he sat down with Triggernometry, which is one of the largest, well, I don't know if they're conservative, they're more libertarian or at least freedom-oriented podcasts in the UK. And when he went on there, he praised the Freedom Convoy. Well, I should hope so. They're the reason he's the leader, by the way, because they put the run on Erin O'Toole for not meeting with them. But it's nice to see him properly credit them for peacefully protesting the government and then ultimately having their civil liberties stepped on all over by the government.
Things that we were frankly truly horrified by, even given that COVID restrictions in this country were pretty stringent, is some of the things that happened with, people who were protesting against things in Canada having their bank accounts taken away. We had supporters of our show writing in going like, please, can you cover this? Is there something about Canada that make, the Canadian psyche that made you guys more susceptible to this? Is it just you had a particular leader at that time who was more authoritative? Like, what was that about?
It was the government itself. It wasn't broadly the people. The truckers in question, they were just looking to be heard. Most of these people had never protested anything in their lives. Through the early COVID days, they were considered the heroes because they were literally driving on lonely highways across international borders, often for weeks away from their families in total isolation, bringing us the things to our homes that we could not live without. And then when the time came for them to be heard, the government robbed them of their liberties. And by the way, this is no longer a controversial view. I think it's a federal court now has ruled that the use of the Emergency Act to crack down on the protest was a violation of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it has even been accepted by the judiciary that was wrong. And it's a reminder of why we need to, the government has to treat itself as the servant and not the master. And we need to give a bigger voice to the working people of our country who, in this case, were simply looking for the right to speak, to the freedom of mobility and bodily autonomy.
I want to see more of this, Poilievre.
And every time I hear him speak lately, I just get angry at those Eastern and Central Canada liberal voting boomers. If you voted Conservative, please, I'm not talking about you, but they took this from us. This man who understands civil liberties, the rights to peaceful protest. He mentioned Section 6 of the Charter, which is freedom of movement, freedom of protest. These were things that were taken away from us by the government. Now, I will correct him on one thing, because he did say it was largely the government, not the people. That is true, but it was also largely the leadership of his own party, because there was no opposition to those mandates reasonably from the opposition party until the Freedom Convoy stood up and inspired the opposition party to find itself and actually oppose something from the government. And it ousted Erin O'Toole and brought in a renaissance for the federal Conservatives so that they became conservative again instead of just, I don't know, conservatives in red ties.
Yeah, and it really spoke to the volume of the silent majority who was just, typically, and again, another play on words, is happy to just kind of truck along, remain unbothered, just wants to get on with their life. And they had been so deeply infringed upon for such a prolonged period of time that they could stay silent no more. And that's where you saw that collective silent majority, truly grassroots coming together of everyday regular Canadians to finally say enough is enough. And I liked that they framed the question saying, is it something about the Canadian psyche? Because actually, I think that was a major component of what happened throughout COVID. We know that the government deployed massive psychological operations and behavioral science tools onto the population without their knowledge or their consent. And naturally, when you have these technologies covertly deployed upon you, the messaging, the incessant radio stations, TV, overhead speakers at every supermarket, when you have this incessant messaging and fear and propaganda targeting literally your psyche, absolutely it's going to affect how you respond and what kind of measures you want to see in place. And I think that was a major component and will only continue to get worse the more that we ignore
Right.
that this is happening through our health agencies and is really ingrained. Behavioral science has become so deeply ingrained in federal health policy and the policy making that most Canadians don't even know they're being victims of psychological operations, and it's done so covertly. And the sad part is taxpayers fund every single bit of it. And then on the truckers thing, I just want to point back to, not to get too far into the dark COVID days, but those truckers suffered immensely throughout those
Yeah.
initial lockdown periods. My husband was a heavy equipment operator, and he would rely, he'd be up at 4 a.m. driving truck on the highways, wherever he needs to be. And they relied on the ability to like go into a coffee shop, to use
Right.
the bathroom, to get a coffee. And so when all of that stuff was shuttered, these truckers had no en route stops where they could stop to use the
Right.
bathroom, where they could stop to grab a coffee, because you couldn't go inside. But also, if you're driving heavy equipment, you can't go through the drive-through. So some of these guys were literally getting out of their trucks and walking through drive-throughs, trying to, go on the side of the road to use the restroom. And I'm sorry, I have to cough, but that's my.
Oh, Tamara muted herself so that she can cough. Yeah, just going back to the issue of the psyche of the country, there were places in this country um, where I think we're culturally different. Um, and again, I'm going to be a bit of a Western chauvinist, so you guys can get mad at me in the comments if you want. But it is true, the Freedom Convoy, while there were participants from everywhere in this country, and I'm proud to say it because I think that was one of the moments where, while the government continues to try to divide us, we really were united for the first time in a long time. And I think not really ever since, um, uh, in uh, in opposition to the government. But the Freedom Convoy was organized in the West. Much of the restaurant rebellion came out of the West. The church rebellions largely in the West. You saw our pastors getting arrested. Now I know there were good churches all across this country that stood up, and businesses that stood up here and there, but they were really sort of isolated cases. Hey, Pastor Phil, I'm talking about you. And Pastor Henry, you also. But there was something to be said about the culture of freedom in certain parts of this country that just could not abide seeing what was happening in other places for any longer. I mean, the lockdowns in Ontario and Quebec went on so long, like unreasonably long, like 90 weeks into 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and people just said no more. And um, I think we haven't seen our country come together really since. And I think that that's probably the point of the government, isn't it?
Well, and that's why I think people are so happy to see Poilievre coming out
Yeah.
strong again on some of these topics, on some of this stuff, because it's so overdue.
Yeah. 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 We can never let that happen to us again. And in other countries, they hold the people to account for doing these things that have now been deemed illegal by at least 4 judges. For example, in South Korea, their former prime minister invoked martial law, which is the Emergencies Act, for I think a total of 6 hours to sort of squash an opposition uh, uh, opposition attacks on his government. And he has just been found guilty of illegally using martial law to save his own government, and he's been sentenced to life in prison. Life. In fact, the prosecutors wanted the death sentence, which would be the maximum penalty, because that's how egregious it is to violate the civil liberties, the God-given freedoms of so many people. It's akin to kidnapping, by the way. That's why certain American states take kidnapping so seriously, is because you are violating the life and liberty of the individual by keeping them from exercising their life and liberty. So that's why in some states, like, you'll get life in prison for kidnapping. They kidnapped an entire country, the Liberals, and they've just skated.
Yeah, house arrest and also detainment, the COVID jails
Yeah.
and the forced isolation, especially of children. That was horrendous. Like we had reports back then of parents slipping dinner to their kids under their doors. That was
Yeah.
just absolutely wild to live through.
Yeah, you know what's funny? I just got finally, just now they're releasing access to information on quarantine sites from Public Health Agency of Canada. And um goes to my point that certain parts of this country were a little different when it came to this stuff. I've got a story coming out, but there's a reason they didn't put one in Alberta the way they wanted to. They just had to use the COVID jails at the airport. Yeah, we were having none of it, which makes me very happy.